Good morning. My name is India Nielsen Barfus, and I am the Associate Director of Operations in the Utah Division of Outdoor Recreation. Thank you for joining today's Summit Speaker Series, and of course, welcome to the end of 2022. We are going to be learning a little bit about Arch's Visitation and Arch's visitor experience. And I'm pleased to introduce today's guests, who are Cassidy, Wayne, Jake, and Irie. Cassidy Jones is our moderator, and she manages outreach and engagement for the National Parks Conservation Association's Southwest region. Cassidy is based in Salt Lake City and works to connect communities to NPCA's work and build advocates for the parks in Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. Born and raised in Wasatch County, Cassidy has a natural interest in parks, public lands, and politics, but she fell in love with national parks while interning at the John F. Kennedy National Historic Site in Massachusetts. She's been working with parks ever since as a park ranger at Timpanogos National Monument, a graduate research assistant with the University of Utah's Park Recreation and Tourism Master's Program, and is an advocate for the past 5 years with NPCA. Wayne Friedman is a professor of environment and society at Utah State University, where he is currently leading the Moab extension program. He was previously with the University of Montana, where he worked with Glacier National Monument for more than 20 years, and Wayne specializes in recreation policy and advanced visitor management. Irie Wheeler is a doctoral student in environment and society at Utah State University's Institute of Outdoor Recreation and Tourism. She was previously with the University of Montana, and her prior work includes work with Glacier National Park, including dark sky accreditation, and her current research focus is visitor experience in Arches National Park and other public lands around Moab. And finally, Jake Garfield is Deputy Director of the State of Utah's Public Lands Policy Coordinating Office. Jake's role in the state government is to help facilitate dialogue and cooperation between state agencies and federal land management agencies, including the Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Forest Service, and National Park Service. Jake previously worked for the Utah Association of Counties as its Public Lands and National Resources Legal Counsel. He holds a law degree from BYU and a BS in economics from the University of Utah. Jake lives in Sandy, Utah, and enjoys recreating in Utah with his 4 very rambunctious kids. So thank you all for being here, and I will go ahead and turn the time over to Cassidy to really kick things off.
Thank you, India. Thanks everyone for being here this morning. Appreciate your patience with my voice. Seems like 80% of the people I interact with this month, I'm a little under the weather, but we're doing our best here. I am so pleased to be able to talk with you all about this topic today. Our title for today's session is Arch's Visitation Patterns and Visitor Experiences. And we're going to have a nice little mix of presentation and discussion about this very rich topic, of course. But our main purpose is really to learn about visitor use management as a social science, and also to discuss how it can best serve visitors as well as the local community. Here's kind of the game plan or our roadmap. First, we're going to hear some findings from Utah State University's research about visitors to Arches National Park. What were their experiences like with the timed entry pilot? Then we'll move into a conversation about the scope and limitations of that research, and kind of delve into some conversation about possible opportunities for the future. And then, as India mentioned, we're going to have some time for audience questions. I do encourage you to use the chat function for the Q&A. I'll be monitoring it. It really helps me kind of group like questions and do some sorting so that we can have a really efficient Q&A for our speakers towards the end of the session. So please do use that as things come up for you throughout the session. And I'm going to tell you a teeny bit more about myself, but I would like you, as I do that, to let me know about you. And if you could do that in the chat, this will be a nice little practice for using the chat. I invite you to enter kind of what your name is, where you live, or you're calling from, what have you, and how you're connected to outdoor recreation, whether it's a professional role or another kind of purpose that'd be really useful. So there's your prompt in the chat. This will be fantastic for us to just hear a little bit more about who you are and who's here to learn today about arches. So I'm going to give you all 60 seconds to do that. And in the meantime, I thought I'd just share with you a teeny bit more about the National Parks Conservation Association. For those of you who've not come across me or NPCA before, I live in Salt Lake City, working in the Southwest region for the national nonprofit, which is the National Parks Conservation Association. We have a small team of 3 in Utah, but are very connected to kind of the success and protecting and preserving the national parks for current and future generations. That's our whole goal. And we welcome your outreach if you have more interest in national parks, whether it be arches or other places. Certainly connect with me. I'd be happy to have more discussions. Got a lot of good things coming in here. Folks are coming from the Wasatch Front. Folks are also coming from Eastern Utah. Fantastic. A lot of Moab friends. Welcome. I'm so glad that you could make it. This is great. Thank you. Please keep typing and setting those things in. Great to see some fellow Wasatch back folks. As a Wasatch County kid, glad to have somebody here from the Wasatch back. Great. Okay. Well, we're going to go ahead and dive in with a couple of questions to kick us off for Wayne and Irie of Utah State University. So if you all have slides to share, this is the time to bring it up. My first general question for the team is around kind of the history of visitor use management as a social science. So Wayne and Irie, would you like to kick us off on that topic?
Sure. Thanks, Cassidy, and thanks everybody for joining us this morning. It's really great to see such a nice turnout. I'll show a slide on this in a little while because it's a little bit. And Irie, maybe we should just get going. I think with the beginning of the presentation we're going to give hits on some of this, and also talks about how arches has featured, at least within the National Park Service, in the kind of development of visitor management and research to support that. But in a general sense, certainly over the last 50 to 60 years, we've had formal recognition of recreation as one of the multiple uses of our public lands, or we've had a mandate like visitor enjoyment within the National Park Service. And these present some fairly vague kind of things that you're supposed to strive for, like solitude or enjoyment or satisfaction. And they're not necessarily the easiest things to understand or to have a common understanding of. So very early on in that process, we started a line of research to try to better understand how visitors feel about the conditions that they're experiencing, what their motives are for being out there, what constitutes success in an experience for them. And so what we're going to present today kind of tacks on to that long tradition of research. And programs like USU have been leaders in that for 50 years at least. And we're trying to maintain that role. So should we just go for it here, Cassidy? Is that all right?
That's perfect. I know we're really excited to hear about some of your methods as well as the findings.
Okay, super. Okay, so here's what we're going to try to do, get some background on visitor use management at arches in general, which fortunately for us parallels what's happened in our field. We'll present some of the results from this last summer's and October's study, and then we'll have some discussion with y'all. So let's go ahead, Irie. In the early 1990s, Arches became a pilot project for a new program within the National Park Service called the Visitor Experience and Resource Protection Program. And in a slide in a moment, you'll see kind of why Arches was picked. But the 1980s were one of these big surge years for visitation in the national parks, and Arches tripled in visitation during that decade. And when you have change happen quickly like that, you don't usually have the resources to attend to that change. So their budgets hadn't really changed, their staffing hadn't changed, but the visitation tripled from, at the time, 250,000 to 750,000 people. So it was a good place to try out some emerging ideas that had been built partially in the Forest Service, partially out of the wilderness world, and then were adapted to the National Park Service in the Visitor Experience and Resource Protection Program. I hate to date myself like this, but I was then a PhD student and worked on the pilot project at Arches in the early 1990s. So I've got a long history with Arches as well. That evolved into a multi-agency visitor use management framework that was anointed by everybody in 2016. So all of the federal agencies have kind of tacked on to that sort of thing. And there's a lot in this framework, and I think it's a really nice kind of best practice model for whether you're working with the BLM or the Park Service to help you think through the questions associated with visitor management. But one of the main things is the strategies that a manager has to work with, and then some principles that underlie those strategies. So they tend to start at the top of this list on the right here, by modifying the use or the behavior. And that's generally done with information and education and that sort of thing. It's in the least obtrusive way possible for lots of reasons. I mean, people are going out onto these trips and they're trying to get away from a structured life all the time, generally. And it's a very cost-effective way for a manager to try to communicate what they're hoping will happen out there. And that sort of moves down the line as your issues intensify to zoning or hardening sites and rebuilding trails and doing more active restoration. And then finally, down at the end of the line, you end up with these more direct things to modify visitor behavior, and that timing of use is one of those. So where Arches is now is kind of down to the end of the kind of line that you would want to have tried these unobtrusive things first to see if you can make them work. If not, then we use something a little more direct. So Irie. So Arches has come a long way. If you look at this graph, the line is the annual visitation that you'll see starting in the 1960s and the different perceptions that we've had of Arches over the decades. And so back in the Desert Solitaire days, Arches was still one of the last bastions of real primitive wildness, about to be developed and roads hardened, that sort of thing. And we may even then think that, if we can go back to that, you may even then think that there wasn't a lot going on, but there were 100,000 people a year coming through Arches, even when Edward Abbey was out there writing. So it was maybe busier than might have been perceived. And then you'll see this kind of 1980s kind of escalation that led to when Arches became a pilot project for a bigger visitor management kind of program. And then you'll see that over the years, they started a number of different kinds of things to try to deal with this continuing kind of escalation in demand. So people that are from Moab here or in Utah, you'll remember when the Don't Bust the Crust stuff really came out, and that was kind of attending to that time at the turn of the century. In Arches, once the few demonstration projects were kind of finalized, they were able to get some more funding, saw a lot of trail redesign and trying to harden sites, and especially at the busier kind of places. Later on, parking was expanded. And then by 2018, they were trying to deal with congestion management plan, and they looked through a lot of different alternatives, including shuttles and bike lanes and expanding access and a number of different kinds of things. And that plan didn't quite fly. So now here we are at timed entry, and there's but it's important to know that this comes as a long kind of conversation that's happened over decades that ARCHES happens to be part of. And there's been research along the way to help support understanding some of these kinds of things. So it's for my perspective or Irie's perspective, it's a nice park to work in because, we're not the first ones coming in just trying to figure out what's going on here. This is a long conversation. Try the next slide, please. So what triggered the timed entry at ARCHES this time? And like we've seen in other parks around the country, this isn't something that a manager tends to want to jump on as their first choice. But when you get to where you have safety considerations, like you see here, where the cars are actually spilled out onto the highway, or really problems with, next slide, please, Irie, with the actual experience. So, this was actually early this year before the timed entry system started. I snapped this picture when I was driving by, and you'd end up with these long lines of people. You could sit in that line for an hour to get up to the front and then find out that the park had been filled and be asked to turn around and come back in 3 to 5 hours. So that's not exactly the experience that people are looking for either. Irie, the next slide, please. This is 2021, the green lines, and this is taken out of the National Park Service story map that goes along with their planning. But in 2021, the green lines are the time of day when they had to close access because all of the parking with inside of the park was saturated already. And so at the beginning of the season in April, you see they were probably closing by about 10 in the morning. And then over 100 different days, they had to do that. Sometimes they had to do it twice. And by the end of the, I guess it's June 30th here, you see people are starting to come much earlier in the day. And then they're having to close it earlier, right? So people start to figure out how the system works. They keep trying to come earlier, but the same basic issue is happening. So there was an impact to the experience that was happening with or without timed entry. There was a kind of a natural or unplanned kind of regulation of access that was occurring. Next, please. So the idea with timed entry, and this is the kind of visitor flows daily, also taken from the NPS, is that you see people get up, they have breakfast, they have a cup of coffee, and they all head out to the park at the same time. And by 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, you end up with this big surge of visitation that hits. So it's not necessarily that there's too many people that are hitting the park, it's that they're hitting it all at the same time. And it's creating this kind of bottleneck. And so the idea with, and I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but the idea with the timed entry is to try to redistribute that use throughout the day to take advantage of the efficiencies that could be gained by expanding the use of the day and filling in the times that are not being filled up. Okay, so Irie, I think we hand it over to you here, and she's going to take us through the study. So like I mentioned, I've been involved with research here for a long time. This presented a good opportunity to try to understand how a system like this is going to affect visitor experiences. And we had done an evaluation similar to this in Glacier National Park the previous summer when they had started a timed entry system there. And I also want to plug NPCA quick, that they were able to help with some support for these studies that made it possible to do in the short amount of time that we had to plan that and put it together without going through the full federal kind of regulatory process to do a study. So thanks, NPCA. And thanks,
Okay,
Irie.
so as Wayne said, we had the opportunity during the pilot season of ARCHES timed entry to conduct some research specifically of visitors inside the park, trying to understand First, how visitors find out about, use, and evaluate the system, whether or not it adds or detracts from their overall experience. Does the system impact perceptions of crowding once inside the park? And additionally, what was the experience of visitors post-timed entry in Arches? So did these visitors intentionally visit after timed entry? What was it like once they were inside of the park? We did that with a follow-up survey during the months of October and early November. Let's see. So the methods that we used a Qualtrics survey instrument. During the summer months, from July 6th to October 3rd, we surveyed visitors in 3 high-use areas inside of Arches National Park. The survey was longer. It took visitors an average of 8 minutes. And we got a sample size of 537 participants. We intercepted 783 visitors with a response rate of 69%. During the fall months, we went in from October 4th to November 7th, and we asked a much shorter survey of visitors that evaluated the visitor characteristics, planning, whether or not they chose to come to Arches or the Moab area during the fall season because of timed entry or other reasons. So this survey took people about 2.5 minutes, much shorter. We intercepted 481 visitors in that month. 402 agreed to participate in our survey for a response rate of 84%. So some of the major characteristics of respondents, they were primarily first-time visitors, both in the summer and the fall, with 79% in the summer and 75% in the fall. They're mostly domestic visitors, about a 50-50 split on gender, average age in the mid-40s, well-educated, relatively affluent, and predominantly white. This is not surprising respondent characteristics for national park visitors based on other studies. So a couple things that were a little different between the 2 samples. We did ask people to describe their planning for this trip. You'll see the orange is summer visitors and the blue is fall visitors. In general, the visitors in the summer were planning their trips a little more, whereas the fall visitors had some less pre-planning and were more likely to be spontaneous visitors. We also asked people, well, how would you describe your planning, but also when did you make your decision to visit Arches National Park? And again, you'll see that the fall visitors were planning more likely on the same day of their visit or a week or a month before, a little more spontaneous in their plans to come to Arches National Park. So going forward, everything in orange is from the summer sample and everything in blue is from the fall sample, just to keep that straight for everybody. So we did ask people where they got their information prior to arriving in Arches about timed entry, and a majority of visitors got their information from the National Park Service website, 65%. There were also people who had heard about it from friends or word of mouth. We also asked people to rate specific components of the timed entry system at Arches, and this was during the summer. Some important things to note: we had a fairly high means on all of the ratings of the system. The easiest things for people, the things that had the highest means, were access to the visitor center and the ease of obtaining tickets. In general, the respondents who were inside the park and we talked to felt like they had a pretty good experience getting their tickets. The area that needed the most work, with the lowest mean, still relatively high with a mean of 3.93, was National Park Service communication of there being a new system and its requirements. And that reflects the general, just that this is a pilot system and it is new. But it is also important to note that the standard deviation, while highest for this one, was relatively low for all of these aspects of the timed entry system. We also asked people if they're aware of the timed entry system before coming to Arches or to the Moab area, and a lot of people were. There were still 22% that were not aware of the timed entry system prior to arriving in Moab, but they found out about it once they got to Arches. And then we asked people, did they attempt to obtain advance tickets prior to their visit? And 89% of respondents attempted and were successful. Another 3% attempted and were unsuccessful, and 7% didn't try. And those people were people that we talked to early or late. They'd come in during a time of the day when timed entry was not required.
Irene,
other
could I
things
say just a couple more things about that last sample?
Of course.
So that last 7%, could you just provide the audience with a little bit more context about the opportunities for entering the park outside of timed entry?
Yeah, of course. So there, this goes back to our methods a little bit, which we didn't talk about. We did sample in the park in the early mornings. Throughout the day, we spread out our sampling time. So we talked to people in the mornings and the evenings. There were opportunities for visitors to come into Arches National Park without a timed entry ticket before, I'm now forgetting, I think 6 a.m. and after 5 p.m. were the times at Arches. I get Arches and Glacier times mixed up a little bit. So there were people who would come in either early or waited till 5 p.m. and came into the park in the evening. And so if a lot of the people that we talked to, even in the mornings or evenings, had attempted to obtain a ticket, and most of them had gotten it successfully, but they still sometimes chose to come in during other times for temperatures or photography or other reasons. But there were that 7% we talked to that had come in during a time when timed entry wasn't required and had just not tried to get a ticket before they arrived. Thanks, Cassie. And feel free to jump in at any moment. I know you've seen this presentation a few times, so if I'm missing something.
Will do.
We also asked people how generally the timed entry contributed to their experience once in the park we asked on a whole. So we asked them if they improved or detracted from their experience. About 38% said their experience was about the same. Very few said that it made their experience worse. There was 57% that said it was somewhat better or much better on the whole. And let's see. And we also asked people if they were to visit in the future, very generally, would they prefer to have a system in place to obtain a reservation and to enter Arches National Park? And about 84%, a majority of respondents said yes, in the future, they would like there to be some sort of reservation system. This does not mean that they feel like the current pilot timed entry system should continue exactly how it was. There is opportunities for feedback, and many people had enjoyed it and thought it made their experience better, but also felt like there were ways that it could be improved and we could all work together to tweak these systems. We got a lot of anecdotal feedback from visitors, which was a very nice, good thing to get. We also asked people who were returning visitors, and think back to that first slide on respondent characteristics. 79% of respondents were first-time visitors to Arches National Park. So our sample in the top part is relatively low. We had 111 visitors who responded to this and had visited on a past trip and were able to compare their current trip and their past trip. But generally, crowding on the trails and at the Arches and ratings of there being too many people in the park were lower on their current trips. So I'm getting these mixed up. So 8%. So it was more of a problem crowding at the Arches and on the trails was more of a problem on their past trips than it was on their current trips. You can see there almost nobody said that those were a big problem. And again, a very small sample, but generally those people who were returning visitors felt like it had improved their experience. So then, like I said earlier, orange is summer, blue is fall. So now we're on to the post-timed entry survey. We asked people generally about their support for management of visitation Arches National Park. And there's a lot to look at in this slide. I wouldn't worry about all of the components too much. We can follow up with this if anyone has additional questions, but light blue is strongly agree, dark blue is strongly disagree. Generally, people said that if congestion or crowding delays cause emergency situations or impair the maintenance of facilities, that there should be some sort of action taken to manage the visitation of Arches National Park. And these are visitors who came to the park during a time when timed entry was not in place. Another important thing to note is this bottom one, reservations should never be implemented, even if use is high. So these is asking people essentially, if just as a bottom line, they don't think these systems should happen, even in Arches. And you'll see that the dark blue and the medium blue are strongly disagree and somewhat disagree, and a majority of people disagreed with that statement. They thought there were situations where a system like managed access should be implemented. Okay. And then finally, we also asked people directly To what extent the following influenced their decisions to visit Moab during the fall season rather than a different one. A majority of people, again, light blue is very much, dark blue is not at all. Temperature was the biggest factor. Most people chose to come during the fall months because of the temperature. Another reason was that their vacation or schedule allowed them to visit during that season. In the middle, you'll see we asked if there was no reservation system like timed entry in place in Arches, and if that's why they chose to visit in the fall. And you'll see that there is 51%, so a slight majority said that was not a factor at all. There was 23% that said that was somewhat or very much the reason that they came during the fall season. So there were these people who had just specifically chosen to visit during October and early November because there was no timed entry in place. All right, and I think I'm going to turn it back over to Wayne for a couple concluding remarks, unless Cassidy has any final clarifying. Okay.
Thanks, Irie. I'm going to combine a little bit here with the experience we had up at Glacier National Park also in the previous summer. And I think some of these results are probably a little bit surprising for folks, but at Glacier, when we asked if they wanted a reservation system on future visits, 70% said yes. At Arches, it was 84%. Both higher than I might have anticipated going into this research. And so it seems like, to me, and this is, our interpretation of some of this, but, increasingly we're seeing visitors that are seeking predictability, that the bad kind of image of overcrowded national parks has permeated society enough that people are willing to give up some of that spontaneity to be able to know that they're going to be able to get in when they want to get in. So we're seeing planners. They seem to be accepting these more structured systems. And then once they're in there, they're enjoying their visits and would support having it again. Overall, the visitation was still strong in these parks. I mean, I think this was a weird year because there were a lot of crazy things going on. Inflation was high, gas prices were at record levels, airlines were getting terrible press and providing lots of bad experiences. So it's hard to sort out, but still almost 1 million people came through Arches in April through September. They're pretty positive about this, and they're going to probably use word of mouth in the way that we always have in this field. And so I would expect that, we end up with a kind of a positive feedback cycle. If you're a person that can plan ahead and likes this stuff enough to accept some of these structured systems, it's very likely that we'll see that visitation segment grow. We didn't spend a lot of time on it here, but managed access, and we see this in the combination of the two studies, but it definitely redistributes use and use patterns. And we did see people at Arches that came at a time that they didn't initially prefer. So they came at a different time of day, or they waited and came in the evening because they didn't have a ticket, or they, went someplace else, for the day while they were waiting to get in. And we saw that at Glacier too. So we realized that puts strain on the surrounding system to some extent. If you're over getting a surge of people on BLM land or somewhere else, then, are you ready for that? So you need to think, I think, in terms of a system. And then we saw some people that are going to come in October because they would prefer to not deal with this sort of thing. Okay. But once inside of the park at Arches, especially looking at the comparisons of the people that had been here before and were repeat visitors, the conditions were as good or better than in previous trips. And, nearly 60% of them thought that the system made their experience better or much better. So I think the next slide, and we'll just about be wrapped up here. So, every study, you end up with more questions at the end of it than you have answers. And this leads to a lot of continuing questions about, visitation management and how it affects larger systems. And in this case, one of them is, how is this affecting the region, the larger system around here? That's something that we're trying to work on a little bit here in this area. How does visitor perception of these systems evolve over time? We saw a difference between glacier and arches in a year. It seemed like communication was better at arches. Now, glacier came up very fast, and it was a very complex time for them to try to implement something like this. But I wonder if society doesn't kind of get accustomed to this over time, the way we have with getting permits for campgrounds and state parks and lots of other systems. And then there's this notion of disproportional impact to different groups. Equity is a big issue, I think, associated with any managed access, and trying to understand whether you're disproportionately affecting somebody. This is clearly, I think, preferencing people that can plan, and people that can plan probably correlate well with other things like high-speed internet and income and time to be able to do that kind of thing. Flexibility in their schedules. So I think there's a number of questions that the US is going to have to kind of try to better understand associated with these managed access systems. And then how do they affect management and managers? I think it's not easy to be the person at the gate asking people to turn around. And that probably takes a toll of some kind. But then on other parts of the park, it may make things go a lot better. And then how are the systems viewed at the community level? For lots of reasons. We put our energy into understanding what was going on inside of the park. That was where we could get the best sample and bang for our buck for the amount of resources we had. And so there's other systems that we just didn't and can't talk about, didn't talk to and can't talk about. And then finally, how do you monitor this over time? What does success look like? And that sort of thing, which has been a perennial question with all these visitor management frameworks over the years. So Cassidy, I think, and in India with that, those are our comments for today, and can move forward.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much for going through a lot of information. I know folks will be eager to look at some of those graphs in more depth, and we'll talk a little bit about ways they may be able to do that, especially when the study is all published. I just want to kind of reiterate some of the limitations of the study that Wayne did a great job covering around, the survey was done in the park. It's always hard to figure out how to survey people outside of a park. Certainly accept that as a limitation of this study that could be done more or differently by a different study, as well as the point about equity and accessibility. I really appreciate Wayne covering that, and I'm seeing it already start to pop up in the chat. It's certainly kind of a lingering question that is probably, if I can phrase it this way, really a limitation of the National Park Service, visitation writ large, and many, studies as well as managers and other community advocates have been trying to crack this nut for a long time. So I'm glad the audience is kind of perceptive about that as well. Before we go full blown into some of these audience questions, I do want to invite Jake Garfield to chime in a little bit here as Wayne, Irie, and Jake kind of talk through some opportunities moving forward with this system, improving the pilot for future years. There's been a lot of thought and conversation given to this topic, and it feels really important to me because the hallmark of visitor use management is that it is adaptive. The purpose of pilots like the one we saw in Arches this year is to learn, as what study like this one helps us do, and improve and change actively due to changing conditions. So it very much sets it up for alteration and improvements for the future. I want to pass it over to Jake and then Wayne and Irie to discuss some opportunities for the future.
Awesome. Thanks, Cassidy. So first of all, I just want to thank Irene and Professor Friedman for their research. It's going to be so critical in finding ways to improve the timed entry program, because we'll have that research. Again, I come from the state government, just wanted to share the state's perspective on opportunities going forward. My agency in the Office of Tourism, which is another state agency, we had a lot of great dialogue over the course of the year with community leaders down in Grand County and Moab City, with business leaders and with the Park Service itself. But we weren't able to study things systematically the way that Wayne and I did, which is why their data is going to be so useful going forward. What the state government would like to see is they'd like to see all of our national parks and our public lands welcoming and accessible to visitors and residents. And just as the data that we just saw shows, timed entry can be such an important tool in making our parks more welcoming and more accessible. And I think now is a great time to take the look at opportunities to make it even better. As Wayne mentioned, there was this was 2022 was a weird year because of gas prices, economic factors that caused a decline in the visitation to all of Utah's national parks. And the visitation to Arches, though still strong, it declined more than our other national parks. We think they may be back to around 2017 levels. And that makes us think that in spite of the other economic factors, there may have been, the timed entry system may have had some impact in lowering visitation. And we think that just means that there's an opportunity to make improvements, to make some changes that make Arches more welcoming, so that people are still having an improved experience because of the timed entry system. But then instead of putting a cap on visitation, that the timed entry system could be used going forward to modify the timing of use to spread out visitation, so that people aren't feeling overcrowded when they're there, and they have a better experience when they are inside the park. And so I just wanted to share a couple of the state government's ideas that we've shared with the National Park Service on how to improve. And Wayne and I please feel free to jump in. One thing that is interesting is because of the international travel to Utah has been down this year. I think chiefly because of the dollar to euro exchange rate, because of the war in Ukraine and other things going on internationally. A lot of international visitors are folks who have language barriers when they come and visit Utah. And these are folks who may have more difficulty using recreation.gov or using the Arches National Park website, which are in English. And it's often international visitors that, though it seems like a little bit old-fashioned from an American perspective, still use travel agencies to organize their travel in Utah. And so something that we suggested to the National Park Service is giving third-party operators the ability to book reservations in the timed entry system, so that visitors with language barriers still have that access to the park. We've also suggested that increasing the use of other languages, of Spanish, French, German, Chinese, what have you, both on recreation.gov or on the Park Service website, could really improve that the accessibility for visitors who don't have the same capabilities using the English language. Other things that we think could improve accessibility was maybe allowing people who have a reservation on recreation.gov to also pay their entry fee on recreation.gov, so that when they're going into the park, they can move through the line more quickly, and we don't have the buildup of cars at the entrance booth. This would be very long term, but we would like the Park Service to at least have more discussions about a potential shuttle system. We use shuttle systems at Bryce Canyon National Park, at Zion National Park to great effect. Those really improve the accessibility, so that more people can visit the park, so that people who are unable to drive, people who may not have the physical ability to drive, are able to visit the parks. And that's something that we may want to. It would be difficult in Arches, certainly because of geography, but it's worth considering at least. We've also seen how the paved multi-use trails, both at Bryce Canyon and Zion, have become extremely popular in the last couple of years, giving people an active transportation option within the parks that doesn't really exist in Arches National Park. It's a very car-centric park. The biking in Arches, it's done by a few people, but most people don't feel safe biking on the narrow shoulders in Arches National Park. So that's another, I think, a long-term and certainly expensive thing, but an option for the park that the Park Service could consider going forward. We feel that there's certainly an incidence of people getting reservations and not showing up. And we would like the Park Service to consider whether they can keep track of how many no-shows there are in a given time period, and then allow visitors who arrive without a reservation to go in lieu of the no-show folks, so that all of the slots within a certain time period are filled, so that there are more people who are giving the opportunity to experience the park, and while still making it a positive and uncrowded experience once they make it in. We also think there's opportunities to improve signage both around the entrance gate, maybe signage just in the Moab community, so that people who maybe arrived in Moab without the understanding what's needed to get a reservation, they can get educated, they can get on their phones and download recreation.gov and try to get a reservation in the short term if they haven't gotten one already. So again, these are suggestions, these are opportunities we think that the Park Service could consider. We're excited that there was a lot of that people did have such great experiences over this past year, and we think that this program, the timed entry program, can be better going forward. We really appreciate how willing that Superintendent Trapp and her staff at Arches National Park have been to listen to feedback from the state government, from the community, and their willingness to consider improvements going forward, and we feel really optimistic about it. Wayne and I don't know if you have any. I think your data will be the best source of concrete ideas for how to improve things. I don't know if you had anything to add there.
I would just, I think, support this area of how to communicate about these kinds of changes in a system is a big, perplexing, complex thing. And we did at Glacier a workshop after their first pilot year to talk to, in that there were Forest Service people in the state and business community and kind of all. And to a person, I think they all thought we need to figure out how to communicate better, because everybody is touching these folks that are coming to visit in one way or another. And so the Park Service certainly could do things with more languages and keep experimenting on how to make that more effective, and how to get recreation.gov to be a little more friendly that way. But it probably will take travel agents and other folks to also be aware of this kind of thing, and to help make sure that they're part of the solution as well. So I really agree that, and I think that is very consistent with a lot of the results we had. And some of the other kind of more strategic things about structural development and all of that, I would leave that to the Park Service folks to comment on. But it's a pilot, it's adaptive management. We're supposed to learn something and try to improve it. So I think there's ample opportunity to do that.
I'll also just add really briefly that being on the ground talking to visitors, I think even the people that were very supportive, they were thinking about ways to improve this also. And a lot of the visitors we talked to echo some of the things that Jake brought up. I think that as the people who care about Arches and the public who cares about national parks and public lands, they were all thinking through ways to improve these systems as well. And we're enthusiastic to share that feedback. But they reflected a lot of the things that Jake shared.
Fantastic. Thanks, everybody. Jake, I feel like some comments you made help answer some folks' questions in the chat about the idea of a shuttle system and various other ideas like that have been floated. And the only comment that I'll make is kind of a planning process that will be some of the next steps after with involving this pilot. There are lots of things to still kind of investigate and look at, and those will be some public processes. I have a question that I'd like to lob to Irie. So from the chat, someone is interested in data from this study or anecdotal, some of those conversations that you had with visitors. Does it hint at why visitors are continuing to choose to visit arches, even if it's not the ads that are getting them? Because they said in their surveys that it wasn't the ads that motivated their visit.
Yeah, so it's a little hard to pick apart, and I can't speak to all the reasons why people might not choose ads, but are choosing arches. One question that we did ask and did not include, we asked a series of questions about place attachment to Arches National Park specifically, and this is something in our field that we use to measure why people come to places like Arches repeatedly, and what Arches means to different groups of people. One question that we did ask was if photos of arches seen before they arrived influenced their attachment to the space, so Arches National Park specifically, and many visitors said that yes, photos had influenced their attachment to arches before they'd even visited. So what that means is even if it wasn't ads, probably a lot of it was social media and other photos that they'd seen on the internet of Arches National Park and of some iconic places like Delicate Arch, that had influenced their decisions to want to choose arches specifically. We can't, I mean, the way that gets tricky is some of those photos could have been ads. So pictures of Arches National Park could have influenced place attachment, and some of those might be ads, and we don't pull that apart. But generally, social media is likely one of those places that contributes to people continually wanting to visit arches. Does that answer your question, Cassidy?
Answers my question, but certainly feel
Could
free
I
to
tack just a little
Yeah.
piece onto that? I mean, I know that we put a campaign out in the summer to promote fall visitation. But what I don't know is what the typical conversion rate is from those kinds of ad campaigns. And so I think in this case, it's maybe 10% of the people were influenced somewhat by that ad. That may not be that far out of whack with typically how much ads make a difference for a person's choice. Now we do know that in the fall, people were making their choices to come sooner in time a little bit. So there may be people on this call here with better expertise that could tell us about how typical that would be.
Ben, feel free to ask any follow-up questions in the chat and we'll get to you. I've got two questions here that kind of have to go with that kind of equitable access or making parks welcoming and inclusive. And one has to do with technology. You know, just what Wayne mentioned, the limitation potentially could be people who don't have access to technology or strong familiarity with technology, that this becomes like a barrier for their access. Do you all have any data-driven kind of points to share about that, and whether you saw that borne out in your research? If not, I have an observation to share.
Irie, I think this might be more in what you saw, or I think the park staff themselves could tell us about it. You know, they would have been interacting with the folks probably at the gate, you know, that didn't have a cell phone or needed to go back and get cell coverage or didn't have a SIM card because they were international or something like that. What I can say was that at Arches we saw much less confusion relative to technology than we saw at Glacier, and a lot of that had to do with the availability of, you know, cell coverage, and you know, so I think in some parks things are going to work better than others. Arches is fortunately pretty close to Moab and has, at least down at the entrance, good coverage. So if you needed to go back out, get to rec.gov, get a ticket, come back in, you didn't have to go all the way back into town and do it. So it wasn't absent, but it didn't, I don't know, Irie, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't really know about speaking to that. I think that there's certainly general like Jake brought up and Wayne was talking about as well, there are certainly groups that that technology wise is difficult for, and that was outside the scope of this study. Anecdotally, I heard some stories, but nothing that was not a majority of people. Some anecdotal concerns or people that said, this would have been really challenging if I hadn't had my kids do it for me, that sort of thing. I think it's definitely reflected in some of the anecdotal comments that we got. So asking other people around them to help out.
Great. When we think about access and making parks welcoming and inclusive, I had heard from park staff that it was folks kind of older folks who were struggling more with the system, and that's a category that I had not thought about in terms of making parks welcoming and inclusive and this barrier of technology. So I wanted to share that. Jake, did you have something else to add?
Oh, I was just going to say, I mentioned, that we had asked that the Park Service allow for travel agencies to book, for their clients. But I think along with that, there might be opportunities to allow just family members to book for their own relatives, even if they're not going in themselves. Just, if there are older folks who may not be as familiar with modern technology, that's one option, I think, to make it more accessible to people who might struggle with recreation.gov or struggle doing things like this on their smartphones.
Great. We're running short on time, but Irie, I was wondering if just in 1 minute, you could offer any other thoughts you have about the excellently phrased question about the concern that timed entry and other more restricted management options will make parks even more difficult to access for folks who've been historically underrepresented in park visitation.
I think that's a very important question, one that is certainly not something that we are able to address in this current study, but something that we should all be thinking about and think of future methods that could be used to better understand this. As far as in our research, there's nothing to suggest that these systems specifically are making it harder for to attract underrepresented groups. I think there's these other issues that we have, such as the amount of time ahead of time that these pilots are announced and the planning and which groups are able to plan more than others, and things that Jake and Wayne brought up about SIM cards or the language of the website. But I think in general, national park visitation, like this person said, attracting underrepresented groups is something we should all be thinking of how to restructure. And I don't think these systems specifically, at least with our 2 studies that we've done and others that I'm aware of, are exacerbating the issue. I think that there's some things like being able to come early or late, especially in arches in the summer when that's a pretty nice time to be in the park, allows it so that people maybe who weren't aware of the system or had a hard time navigating getting a ticket, there are alternatives, and that certainly helps. So I guess I don't have a direct answer. Maybe Wayne has something to add.
Our demographics seem to line up with pretty typically with Utah National Park visitation, with the exception of dominantly domestic, this absence of international visitation, which Jake mentioned, is happening. So it feels to me, and I think a lot of people would agree, that if we want the national parks visitation to truly represent the diversity of our nation, we've got a long ways to go. We on all kinds of fronts, and this may be exacerbating it a little bit to have a timed entry system, but I think the issue is probably much bigger and much more structural, and it's not the kind of thing we're going to find out in studies like what we just did, because we're talking to the people that are there, and we're going to need some much more creative ways, I think, to talk to the people that don't feel welcome or can't afford to come or whatever.
Excellent. Thank you both. All right. I think we can go ahead, even though we are over time. I just saw a couple questions come in. So if folks are able to stick around and you'd like to, we'd love to entertain a couple more questions. Also lovely if you've got to drop off. We'll keep this pretty brief. Thanks for your patience. I'm curious to know about Kevin's question in the chat about other studies planned for investigating Moab in the area and sort of visitors to the area and how they're spending their time, especially when they're not in the park.
I will try and not get too excited about that question, but I'm trying so that people can leave. I know we are 2 minutes over, but this research, to answer his question, this research is of special interest to me and part of my PhD dissertation. And the second chapter, the where else people are going, is of huge importance. We did ask some questions of where people said they were going to go in this survey, and we were going to look at those results. So in other words, if you weren't able to get your desired time or day, what else did you do? We asked about other public lands and things in town that people might participate in. The second chapter of my dissertation is looking pretty specifically at other things where people are going within the Moab area if they aren't in Arches. And we haven't started exploring that, but we are getting ready to dive into that question and looking forward to it. Or I am.
I'll just add, we finished data collection just a few weeks ago, and so we're still presenting fairly descriptive results, and there's more that we can learn from this data that we have by taking the time to dig into it. So we're hopeful to have a report that we can be circulating, more broadly in January. And kind of until we get that out, I don't know that we're thinking about the next steps with more research. But like I mentioned, with these kinds of studies, you get a lot more questions than answers at the end of it in many ways. So there's a lot to do.
Very exciting. Thank you. So more to come, all my Moab friends. Jake, I've got a question. I'd like you to address Anne's question about how we saw lots of folks come into the park in October and some of those returned challenges of long lines, gate closures due to parking capacity, etc. Is there going to be a reevaluation of the dates that the system is implemented?
Yeah, we've heard that as well. The nightmares all returned as soon as that time entry wrapped up. So yeah, we have officially requested that the Park Service considering extending the dates of the timed entry, both maybe start a little early in the spring and go a little later bit in the fall. That's obviously it's their call, it's their decision, but we've made that request. And maybe in the middle of the summer when it's 100 degrees and things slow down, do we push pause on the timed entry system? We haven't proposed that, but it's worth considering. But absolutely, we think it makes sense to do more timed entry both in spring and fall.
Great. And that's a great recommendation for the National Park Service to make sure that they hear those kinds of things. The other two that I'll just say are important things to share with the National Park Service that are questions lingering here are about the percentage of reservations that were no-shows. So folks who made a reservation and didn't show up, asking that question because the National Park Service also collected their own data in different kinds of things, and they're in the process of analyzing that. So hopefully we'll have answers to questions like that at a later time from the National Park Service. And this idea of connected to reservations, setting some aside specifically for underrepresented groups is a good one that I haven't heard before. And it's a good thing to ask the Park Service if maybe it's been done elsewhere. Certainly interesting. And I think that generally wraps us up with questions. If folks, as India mentioned in the chat, have lingering ones, she's dropped an email address into the chat. You're welcome to send them and she'll make sure they get to the right people. But for now, I'm just so pleased we could have such a great dialogue with such a big group today. Thank you all for making it with this rescheduled date and for your interest. Looking forward to continuing the conversations, and big thanks to the Division of Outdoor Recreation for bringing us together, and to Irie, Wayne, and Jake for sharing your expertise. Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody.